All right, Andre, welcome to the podcast. It's so good to have you on. I am really looking forward to this conversation because you and I really, first of all, we have been vibing off of the Virgo energy,
Just
which
had
is
to
what
bring that
brought
one
us
up.
together. You knew that was coming. You knew
Of
that
course.
was coming. But also the work that we do, there's also energy around and synergy around the work and the impact we're looking to make. And so would love for you to just open up with an intro, tell us who you are, what you do, and the impact you're looking to make on the world.
All right. Thanks, Angela. Outside of the Virgo connection that we got, um, so for me, I've been doing my work predominantly within urban planning for just over 20 years. And and I've spanned everywhere from Los Angeles to Edmonton to the Greater Toronto area doing this work, and also in the spheres of transportation and housing. And those are the two biggest areas when it comes to inequities and inequalities, whether it's in policy, how we build, what we build, etc. And it's not just racial; it's also accessibility issues and whatnot. So growing up with my lived experience as a mixed ancestry person, growing up in social housing, I was very observant as to what was going on in my neighborhood. And from the time initially, I was saying to myself, "Hey, I wanted to be a bus driver," and I played with a broken scooter wheel to pretending I was a bus driver. So I knew I was kind of wanting to get into that whole planning space. And then as time went on, going through university and whatnot, I realized that I have this passion towards changing, whether it's
Mm.
from an organizational perspective to the lower level, from the grassroots level. And that's why I initially got into this work of planning. Um, and and so what I'm trying to do is actually change the dynamic of how do we approach planning from a Canadian perspective. And we can go on for this for throughout the podcast. And I've gone into the whole part of the DEI, and how do we bring diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging into the profession. So that's that organizational perspective from the planning side. So, and it relates to a lot of other organizations and what they're going through. So a lot of my work overlaps with what we're experiencing today. And so this is the impact I'm trying to do in terms of not only internally from an organizational perspective, from a DEI perspective, but as well as from a policy perspective, a talent perspective, and what we're trying to do to change the industry. And it's not just me who's doing it. There's other people that are doing it within the Canadian frame. So kudos to those people who are trying to change the narrative. But I'm here to contribute to that as well.
I love that. And I do want to highlight that you're Canadian because I think that's going to enrich our conversation today about DE&I, racism, sexism, classism, all the isms, because we live in two different countries
Mhm.
and the context, the background is different.
Mhm.
So, I think throughout this episode, we'll be kind of uh, vibing off of kind of our lived experiences in this
Yeah.
space, which is going to be really cool.
Mhm.
But what really interests me in your work is the fact that I do not have an urban planning background, but I can easily see the system of urban planning within a community really mirroring how I do my work
Mhm.
from a organizational perspective, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I'm really just working within an ecosystem,
Mhm.
which you are also doing, and you're kind of pairing it up with DE&I. So give us some perspective as to how you kind of make the connection between urban planning, the work that you do in urban planning, but also D&I within an organization.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's a great question, Angela. So, looking at it from the grassroots level, comparing it to what happens in the U.S., we see, in the U.S. we had seen, tear downs of neighborhoods and what they called urban renewal in the 50s, so they can build highways across the country and within our cities, within Chicago, within New York, within Los Angeles, etc., because the car was the domination at that time. And
Mm-hmm.
so when you start to see that, and of course that didn't really happen here, because of the fact, Jane Jacobs, who's the classic activist within the planning circles, she didn't want the same thing happening in Toronto, for instance. So there was some community backlash behind that, and we didn't have that same movement of highways going through our cities and going over neighborhoods and whatnot. But you still have the same issues of gentrification. You still have that within a community perspective. So you're starting to see a lot of the class disparities, the race disparities, the income disparities, etc. And you start to see the similarities to what's happening in the U.S. And so, from an organizational perspective, this is where we start from. What is happening at the top? What is, you know, what have we done from a leadership perspective and from an organizational perspective to allow that to percolate to our communities? And
Mm-hmm.
the people that are not hired in leadership levels do not represent the communities. The people at the entry level do represent the communities, but they're not able to influence that change.
Mm-hmm.
So we see that in the private sector, right? And we're still seeing that uh, that issue coming to hand. But also, and as we mentioned, as I spoke with you before, it's, we Canadians tend to do this. It takes them a little while to get to this point, and so there's a lot of issues there within an organization that still are percolating to the grassroots level, from a Canadian perspective. But there's people out there that are doing the work. So I think that's where it starts.
Mm-hmm.
And then we and then of course you can see the relationship between the two in terms of that, and how do we change that.
Yeah, and you talk about accessibility, and I think, I can't help but think about kind of this new wave of hybrid working and how
Hmm.
that's so. Let me see if I can articulate this the way it's happening in my head. But,
Yeah.
one of the things that we talk about with hybrid working is that it levels the playing field in some cases when it comes to access to certain jobs. So
Hmm.
you no longer have to live in Silicon Valley, and for someone who cannot afford $1 million house or condo in Silicon Valley, I can now work in Ohio and have a tech job, right? And reap the benefits of
Hmm.
that role. When in the past, we had an urban planning, a general planning issue where you had to live where you worked.
Yeah.
And the accessibility really, I can't help but think about the context of neighborhoods and gentrification and how that might have impacted people's accessibility to certain
Hmm.
positions or certain roles or organizations because of where they lived.
Hmm.
And so are you seeing like that conversation being had from an urban planning perspective, the connection between that and the workplace?
So let me enlighten the audience a little bit here. So this first of all, this conversation has been around for decades. And
Mm,
this is more of a conversation around commuting to work, right? And there was always, so there's the active transportation circles. There's how does business contribute to this, and are you going to allow flexible schedules at work, etc. So this conversation's been around for years. It took a pandemic for
mm,
businesses to realize that, hey, we have the technology to do this. Why don't we do this? But at the same time, what we're starting to see is that those people who decide to move to, outside of the city, or to another province, or in the U.S. another state, to do this work, there's tax implications on an organization. There's and of course there's the whole insecurity of leaders in that they want them to come back to work. I mean, they're not at the level of the Elon Musk's craziness of, we're demanding people to go back to work. But,
Mhm.
but there are those organizations who are telling them, okay, we're okay with flexibility in doing, a 2-3-3-2 kind of model. So, accessibility, is in my mind, accessibility more means, the the people in who have mobility issues, right? In
Mhm.
terms of those in scooters, etc. So it's more about equal mobility, and are we able
Mhm.
to have them come to work? Are we able to provide that technology? Are we able to save the environment, especially given the fact that we're in a climate change world, or now considered a climate emergency, if you will?
Mhm.
So there's a lot of that coming into this. So, those are the things that organizations are thinking about. And, and also too, you have to, a little bit off on a tangent here, is the fact that leaders need to be flexible in that work, right? Whether, regardless if you're in urban planning or you're in healthcare or in whatnot, you have to fully grasp the idea of what you as a leader are doing to be flexible and understand what the hybrid environment looks like. Do you lead in a hybrid environment? Do you develop? Can you? A lot of organizations, for example, they tend to a lot of them want the collaborative environment because that's the way they think that things should be done. But you can be collaborative in this environment, right? So there's so many factors involved when it comes to this work, and it's just, and it overlaps, like I say, from an organizational level to
Mhm.
to the ground level.
Yeah, and it's these paradigms that, I think we're all grappling with now, which is checking in on why do I believe that? Why do I believe productivity needs to happen in a
Hmm.
physical space? Uh, but I think what you're saying is deeper. What we're saying together is deeper than that, which is saying this is not just about ways of working collaboration. There's also a ripple effect to you asking, let's say, all your employees to be in an office in a certain location. There are contextual pieces that could create inequities because of that decision,
Hmm.
other than just we can't collaborate. Right.
Yeah.
And that's where I feel like, urban planning is this piece that, like, people don't think about. Climate change is this piece, this ripple effect that we don't think about. Like,
Hmm.
how am I impacting the environment, society,
Hmm.
and the humans on my team?
Right. And you start to see where the inequities are, especially, and now they're more profound when it comes to those who are working in service level employees,
Hmm.
and the commuting patterns. They still have to be front facing
Right.
employees, right? So there's that inequity of, someone like you and I who are from an intersectional lens. We're able bodied,
Hmm.
we either own a car or can take transit, educated, all that stuff. And whereas someone from a different perspective, you start to see those inequities of, the education level. There's oftentimes, especially in the US, we're talking about race, and whatnot. So you start to see those playing out, and how urban planning has contributed to those inequities, right? So those are the things we need to really think about.
Yeah. And so I did want to kind of pause and just kind of acknowledge the fact that, again, you're currently living in Canada. You're Canadian. I'm from the U.S. And oftentimes I think it's really important that, especially us from the U.S., we understand the global context of things like racism,
Hmm.
of sexism, of classism,
Hmm.
of colorism.
Hmm.
So help enlighten the audience on, like, what are the issues you're grappling with from a Canadian perspective, and how might they differ from what we're grappling with in the U.S.
Um, there isn't. I wouldn't say there's that much of a difference, with the exception
Mm-hmm.
of the fact that there's there's blatant in your face racism in the US versus behind your back covert racism that exists in the Canadian perspective. So you'll see it in not just, this is just more of an organizational perspective, or just in general,
Mhm.
in how we live everyday life. Of people will not tell you, or they'll just imply racism or some sort of racist trope to your
Mhm.
to your face or to other people. But also they're hidden in the policies that we've or the programs that
Mhm.
we've implemented over the years. Now that's more of a comparison to what the U.S. has done over the years, where that's the same thing. It's the going back to an urban planning perspective. There's the zoning, there's the urban renewal,
Yep.
all that stuff, right? As I mentioned earlier. So really, there's that difference, but there's still a lot of similarities when it comes to the classism, the colorism that exists, the inequities. Between gender and sexual identity and all that. So we from a global perspective, no matter what, those are the issues. From a
Mhm.
North American perspective, the only really big difference is, is the way racism is conveyed in a whether it's a personal setting or a professional setting.
Yeah, yeah, and it's important to talk about those differences because we do have organizations that are. I mean, I know there's a lot of similarities, but just the context as to where these things originated, how the systems were built, and who they weren't built for,
Right.
might be different.
Right.
So we're dealing with the same things, but for example, we were talking earlier. The U.S. is kind of riddled with slavery.
Hmm.
Not that that didn't happen in Canada, but you all have a history with Indigenous people. And so tell us that, because I just started learning about that history. So tell us a little bit about that too, and how that maybe connects to urban planning and
Yeah.
the workplace too.
Yeah. So, from an indigenous perspective, without getting to a lot of the history, and I'll just summarize it as much as I can, or be as brief as possible. So, with the indigenous peoples, they were, you know, at that, during the early days of colonialism, if you will. They came into the country, and sorry, I shouldn't say they. It's the English, the French. They came
Mm-hmm.
into the country, and were seeking the new world and whatnot. Interacted with indigenous people, and then took over. And then after that, when it came to Confederation, which was in 1867, and later on there was a legislation called the Indian Act, which was meant to be an act that was supposed to level the playing field, and I use that in air quotes, but it doesn't. It actually
Mm-hmm.
created more inequities. And then from there was the establishment of the residential schools all over Canada, which
Mm-hmm.
who took away a lot of the children from their parents and brought them into these residential schools. And you hear and now uh, the news and the issues are coming out, where
Mm-hmm.
where children were missing and murdered, and it still exists even today, where you'd see in a lot of cities where there were missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Mm-hmm.
That is something that has been brought to light. So in that, we also have the what most recently, within the last 5 to 7 years, was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that the federal government had put together. And there are 94, I believe, 94 recommendations within there that talk about how do we engage with communities, how do we create equity within the Indigenous community, economic development issues involved, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all of that. So from an urban planning perspective, is how do we, we are not the, we're not technically in a term, we're not the we don't own the land here. right? With the term that's being called is the stolen land, right?
Mm.
And so so now how do we reconcile with the committee? How do we give back to the community? So there's a lot of engagement with these communities, and that's from an urban planning perspective is, how do we meet them on their terms? Because indigenous cultures are different from normal British white cultures. So how do we bridge the gap between the two communities, and how do we create a partnership in terms of reconciling reconciling and building communities, or I should say, or the more common term, co-create communities with Indigenous people in mind, given the fact that it is their land that we need to respect. And also too, there's uh, on top of that, there's the UN resolution that talks about the recognition of Indigenous peoples that
Hmm.
a lot of organizations have been falling under, and that's what the profession is doing as well. Is understanding that the UN. The UN resolution is also something that we need to think about in terms of how do we reconcile with Indigenous populations. So we've been ahead of the game as opposed to
Hmm.
what's happening in the U.S. when it comes to
Right.
Indigenous issues. I mean, it's not just about casinos, right? There's a lot
Hmm.
more than that, and this is where we need to build that part. We need to continue to build that partnership, and we're doing that. And there's apologies involved. There's other aspects of reconciliation that we're trying to do, not only as an organization but also as professionals, even in the planning field.
Hmm. Yeah, and it's I know that that sliver of kind of an overview you gave is, I mean, there's so much underneath it. So, I'm sure the experience of all of that from, someone, for example, who's an indigenous person listening to this, there's so much more layers and context to
Mm-hmm.
that. And I think that gets to how do we ensure that different identities within organizations are not just acknowledged, because I think we struggle with just the acknowledgement, like the
Right.
fact that you just talked about, like the acknowledgement that we're on stolen land, the acknowledgement that we owe you an apology. I mean, it's just the acknowledgement we struggle with. So let's get to some action, because I do
Mm-hmm.
like to kind of wrap up our conversation with some things that people can do, especially leaders of organizations may be listening to this, community leaders may be listening to this. So with your experience with urban planning, with your experience with DE&I, and understanding how that works within organizations, what are some things that you can do, or start to think about differently, so that you can create more equity within your organization and ensure that your platform is also driving equity and inclusion
Mm-hmm.
with your customers, your partners, your
Mm-hmm.
suppliers, your whole ecosystem.
Right. So this is a huge conversation. When it comes to your suppliers, one thing you need to do is ensure that there's equitable statements, and you start to within your tenders to start to
Hmm.
say, we want to represent our communities. This is who we want to have in our tenders in terms of Black communities, in terms of Indigenous communities, in terms of gender, et cetera, et cetera. So you want to have that perspective within your tenders. Then, from an organizational perspective, you want to have those embedded in your codes of conduct. You want to ensure that you do the same thing as you do in other organizations, where you're looking at your ERGs. You're looking to have that talent pipeline through mentoring, through sponsoring Black and talented women in the workplace, and help them advance, instead of putting them into middle management, or even or don't even advance them to management positions, or even to directors and whatnot. So have those in place. And then you talk about it from the professional perspective. The planning profession is accredited. So a lot of times, like for instance, I just the other day I was making a presentation to urban master's urban planning students, and I was giving them the statistics, and within the statistics, I also said that we're still not at the same level as the American Institute of Certified Planners, where in their code of conduct they have a whole bunch of factors, a whole bunch of language when it comes to
Mm-hmm.
addressing racism, sexism, and creating equity within the planning profession. We're not there yet, and so that's where we need to get more involved from the planning perspective, because the planners in themselves represent the communities. They build for those
Mm.
communities. And then finally, one of the things I want to say too is about education. And so, if we're continuously talking about the same policies, the same histories that created these inequities, then it becomes a problem. So this just becomes a revolving cycle of what are we teaching our students? And I know that some schools are starting to get the message, and they're starting to build courses around social and racial equity, but we're still not there yet. But at least there's the talk of that happening. So I think those are the most important things that are required in terms of how organizations can start the conversation, and then how do they translate from those who want to get into these organizations by feeding them that information of, look, this is what's happened. How do we improve organizations from the bottom up, but also how do we improve the organizations from the top down, understanding that these are the leaders that have perpetuated the racism, the sexism, etc., and brought them down to the communities themselves and created inequitable policies and whatnot. So it's a ecosystem, as you alluded to before, of how do we make change within an organization, regardless if it's planning or not.
Right, and I think you talk about this ripple effect, right, between each of the sectors, which is private sector, public sector, and education. And I think all too often businesses, whether they're in the public sector or private sector, they kind of just like narrow in and they don't think about the other parts of the ecosystem. And so
Mm-hmm.
that is, that's why we are talking about social responsibility at
Mm-hmm.
work, because we're
Yeah.
talking about the workplace, but there is a connecting point. There's the education, right, is a pipeline into who enters the workforce. And the
Right.
workforce has to operate in the context of a society.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to think about those three things like a Venn diagram that just
Yeah.
overlap each other. And so
Yeah.
I love what you're saying. This could probably be like 3 podcast episodes because I have so many other questions, but I think you've given us some things to think about. I
Mm-hmm.
appreciate you bringing your perspective, your diverse perspective, not only from your life experience, but also where you're living, and also from your industry.
Mm-hmm.
So really, really excited to share this episode. And if you could just let everybody know where to find you, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to use you as a resource or hire you for a project, where can they find you?
Sure. So I can be found on LinkedIn and on Instagram, Urban Equity Consulting, and also you can find me on the various channels under André Darmanin, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, etc. You can find me on there, and connect with me on there in terms of any future work. If you want to ask me any questions, or even just want to just riff about different topics that intersect, and how do they intersect even in public health, or even in transportation, or interdisciplinary issues and whatnot. So I'm open to those conversations. And also too, as a shameless plug, if you will, I am the host of the Global Conversations podcast that starts in 2023, and I'll be having probably some same guests as you, and
Mm-hmm.
talking about DEI issues from a global perspective, because I guess the last thing I want to say is that going back to our initial conversation about, the American perspective, is that because the American perspective is feeds into the media. The media feeds into what Canadians listen to or watch and
Mm.
whatnot. It's just becomes this silo effect. And so now I wanted to bring people from outside of that silo to say, what is going on? What can we learn from you in places like Australia in terms of the EMEA area, APAC, et cetera, et cetera? What do we bring from their perspective into what you're doing, and how do you change organizations? Because it's not all about the US, it's not all about Canada, it's about a global perspective.
Love it. Love it. Well, Andre, thank you so much for your time, your brilliance. Thanks for sharing it with my audience, and hope to have you on the podcast soon again.
Yeah, exactly. Great to be here, and same likewise in terms of there's an open invitation for you to be on my podcast.